The summer sun in Brookhaven, Kansas, always seemed to hit the small clapper houses in a way that made the air shimmer. On that particular Sunday, Emily Carter, just 9 years old, was darting barefoot across the Carter family's backyard, chasing after the worn yellow tennis ball her father, Michael Carter, had tossed for her. The smell of grilled burgers drifted from the porch, mingling with the sweet scent of lilacs blooming along the fence line. It was a simple day, the kind Emily loved most, one where Michael's easy laugh filled the air and her little world felt safe and whole. Inside, however, the mood was shifting. Family gatherings had always been a delicate balance, and this one was no exception. Emily's Aunt Karen, sharp-tongued and quick to find fault, was arguing with Michael over something Emily didn't fully understand. She caught only fragments as she ran past the open kitchen door, words like responsibility, truth, and should have told her years ago. But adults argued sometimes, and Emily had learned to tune out the grown-up noise. It was only when she stepped inside to grab a glass of lemonade that the moment came. Karen's voice, sharp as broken glass, sliced through the air. "He's not your real father. Stop calling him Dad." The room went still, and for a moment, the sound of the ceiling fan clicking overhead was the only noise. Emily froze, her small fingers tightening around the cold glass. Her mind scrambled to make sense of the words. Not your real father. They didn't fit anywhere in her world. Michael was her dad. He had taught her how to ride a bike in the park behind their house, bandage her scraped knees, read her bedtime stories in a soft, warm voice until she drifted off. She turned to look at him now, searching for his face in the tense silence. Michael's eyes flickered toward her, brown and steady, but she could see something else there, something heavy. Before she could speak, before anyone could explain, her chest tightened and tears blurred her vision. She dropped the lemonade on the counter with a thud and bolted out the back door. The grass scratched at her legs as she ran, but she didn't care. Her breath came in quick, sharp gasps as she tried to outrun the words still echoing in her ears. Behind her, the screen door banged open. "Emily!" Michael's voice carried across the yard. She kept running until she reached the old oak tree at the far end, the one with the tires swing. There, she finally stopped, pressing her back against the rough bark. Her hands trembled, her small body shaking with sobs she didn't fully understand. Michael approached slowly, his boots crunching on the dry grass. He didn't try to force her to speak. Instead, he crouched down in front of her, resting one hand gently on her shoulder. "Hey!" he said softly, his voice steady in a way that made her want to believe everything was fine. "I don't," she tried, but the words stuck in her throat. "She said you're not." Her voice broke. Michael didn't flinch. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, slow and strong. "Emily," he said, his voice low and certain. "You are my daughter, and that never changes. Not now, not ever." Something in his tone made her want to hold on forever. She buried her face in his shirt, the scent of laundry soap and the faint trace of motor oil wrapping around her like a blanket. She didn't understand what Karen had meant, not completely, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to hear any more about real fathers. She already had one. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Inside, the adults kept their voices lower, the conversation subdued. Karen avoided looking at her, and Emily avoided the kitchen altogether. Michael stayed close, ruffling her hair, making sure her plate was full at dinner, slipping her an extra cookie when no one was looking. That night, as she lay in bed, Emily stared at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over. "You are my daughter, and that never changes." They became her shield against confusion and hurt. She didn't ask questions, not then. But a small seed of curiosity had been planted, one she couldn't quite ignore. From that day forward, she began to notice small things she'd never paid attention to before. The way people sometimes hesitated before saying she looked like Michael. The flicker of something unspoken in his eyes when the topic of her childhood came up. She didn't push for answers. She wasn't ready, but the world no longer felt as simple as it had that morning in the backyard. Still, when she thought about who loved her, who had been there for every scraped knee, every bedtime story, and every whispered, "It's going to be okay." Only one face came to mind. Whatever the truth was, Michael Carter was her dad. That was the only truth she wanted to hold on to. And yet, deep down, she knew one day she would have to hear the rest of the story. By the time Emily turned 14, Brookhaven felt too small for her restless thoughts. The once familiar streets, lined with faded storefronts and wide front porches, now carried a faint sense of confinement. High school had brought new faces, new challenges, and the occasional sting of gossip whispered just out of earshot. There were days she caught snippets, comments about families, about who belonged to whom, and though they never mentioned her by name, she felt the shadow of something unsaid brushing against her. Michael, however, seemed determined to anchor her against the shifting tides. On her 15th birthday, he tossed her the keys to his old Chevy truck and said, "If you're going to learn to drive, you're going to learn the right way." The truck was far from perfect. The radio only worked when it wanted to, and the seatbelt on the passenger side stuck. But to Emily, it was freedom on four wheels. Michael's patience behind the wheel was unshakable, even when she stalled at stop signs or took corners too wide. "You're not here to be perfect," he told her once, as they idled by the wheat fields. "You're here to keep going. That's what matters." By junior year, Michael was a fixture at every one of her basketball games, sitting in the same spot on the bleachers, arms crossed but eyes following her every move, even when her team lost by 20 points. He was there afterward with a quiet smile and a bottle of orange Gatorade. "Proud of you," he would say, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. His consistency became the rhythm of her life, steady, dependable, and unwavering. Still, there were moments when the unspoken past flickered at the edges. During a holiday dinner at her grandmother's, one of her cousins, older and careless with his words, joked about finding out who your real dad is. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't respond. Emily forced a laugh and changed the subject, though the knot in her stomach stayed long after dessert. Those instances never turned into full conversations. They floated away like smoke, leaving her with the same unanswered questions she had carried since childhood. When senior year arrived, the conversations in their small kitchen shifted from grades to college applications. Michael sat with her at the table night after night, reading brochures from universities she could barely imagine attending. He ran his callous fingers over the glossy pages, as though they might reveal something about her future. "You'll go where you want to go," he told her, not as a suggestion but as a fact. And when she hesitated over the cost of tuition, he said, "Well, figure it out. That's my job." The day her acceptance letter came from Wichita State University, she found him in the garage, tinkering with the lawn mower. She held the envelope like it might burn through her fingers. "I got in," she said, her voice trembling between disbelief and joy. Michael looked up, his face breaking into a grin that reached his eyes. He pulled her into a hug, the kind that made her feel, as always, entirely safe. "Knew you would," he said. "You've got more grit than anyone I've ever met." That summer before college was a blur of packing boxes, long drives, and shared silences that spoke more than words. On the night before she moved into her dorm, Michael grilled steaks in the backyard, the scent mingling with the warm evening air. They sat at the picnic table under strings of mismatched lights he had hung years ago, talking about everything except the fact that things were about to change. At the end of the night, as she stood in the doorway ready to head upstairs, he said, "No matter where you are, kiddo, I'm here." Her first months away were both exhilarating and disorienting. The city felt louder, faster, and full of people who didn't know her history. Michael called every Sunday evening, his voice steady over the crackle of the line. He never asked too many questions, just enough to remind her that someone was always listening. When she came home for Thanksgiving, he was waiting at the train station, leaning against a truck, smiling like the months apart had been nothing more than a blink. For years, they had built a life around presence rather than explanations. Whatever questions lingered about biology or legalities were locked away, unneeded in the space they had created. But life, as Emily would learn, had a way of testing even the strongest foundations. And when the phone rang one cold winter afternoon during her second year of college, the voice on the other end delivered news that made the air in her dorm room turn thin. Michael had been in a car accident, and it was serious. In that moment, every mile between them felt like an ocean. She didn't pause to think about unanswered questions or what anyone else might say. She grabbed her coat, her bag, and her keys, her only thought clear and sharp. She had to get to him. The highway gave way to city lights, and by the time Emily pushed through the sliding doors of St. Francis Hospital in Wichita, the night had folded into a cold, metallic quiet. Fluorescent panels hummed overhead, and the smell of antiseptic settled at the back of her throat. A security guard at the desk glanced up, asked her name, and pointed her toward the elevator with a practiced tilt of the head. She rode up alone, clutching her bag to her chest, watching the numbers climb as the elevator were counting aloud the second of a life that had split into before and after. The corridor on the third floor was a river of motion slowed by gravity. Nurses in soft-soled shoes, the creak of carts, the murmur of doctors discussing orders. When she reached the nurse's station, a woman with graying curls looked up and said, with gentle efficiency, that Emily needed to check with admissions before she could be taken back to see him. The words were firm but not unkind, a script learned by heart. Downstairs again, the admissions desk was framed by a glass partition that turned Emily's reflection into a ghost. A clerk with careful penmanship and tired eyes asked for information. Full name of the patient, date of birth, primary address, insurance provider. Emily answered what she could, each detail a small offering, and felt the weight of the blanks that followed. Then came the question that shifted the room's temperature, relationship to patient. Daughter, she said, steady but soft. The clerk paused, glanced at the screen, and asked for legal documentation. Emily blinked, uncertain what counted as proof of love. The clerk's tone did not harden, but became more procedural. Without legal guardianship papers, without a birth certificate naming him, without a healthcare proxy, there were limits. Emily nodded, even though the words scraped like sand in her throat. She signed a visitor form, accepted a plastic wristband that felt like a bracelet of borrowed time, and was told to wait. The waiting room was a study in suspended motion. A television muted above a row of chairs, a table stacked with magazines whose dates were months behind, a vending machine blinking a polite invitation to consume something that could be swallowed without tasting. Emily sat, then stood, then sat again, as if the chair were a shoreline and she kept forgetting whether she was ocean or earth. A mother in the corner rocked a toddler's sleep. A man in grease-stained coveralls stared at his hands. An elderly couple spoke in whispers, their sentences held together by touch more than words. When a nurse passed through with a clipboard, Emily lifted her head with the reflex of hope. The nurse smiled, apologetic, and moved on. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she stepped into the hallway to answer. The voice of her grandmother shook like a screen door in the wind. They exchanged clipped sentences. What happened? Where are you? How is he? Emily repeated what little she knew. There was an offer to drive down in the morning, a promise to call Aunt Karen, and a reminder to eat something. When the call ended, the silence returned unsoftened, and Emily realized she had no appetite for anything except news. She returned to the waiting room and chose a seat near the window, where the city spread out beneath a thin veil of frost. The glass held a reflection, pale and fixed, a face that felt too young to bargain with paperwork and policies. She told herself to breathe as if the air contained instructions. A social worker approached just before midnight, introducing herself with a practiced ease and a voice made for difficult rooms. She sat beside Emily and explained the hospital's protocols in plain terms: next of kin, contact trees, the legal ladder that determined who could sign and who could sit at a bedside after certain hours. Emily listened, nodding when it seemed respectful, her mind skimming the surface of words like authorization and consent. When asked if there was a spouse or a parent who could be reached, Emily said no, not that she knew of. When asked about siblings, she explained Michael was an only child. The social worker took notes, circled something, then met Emily's gaze with a softness that cracked the procedural rhythm. We try to honor the relationships that matter, she said, but we also have to honor the law. The two truths stood like pillars on either side of a narrow bridge. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a surgeon appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with the careful neutrality of someone who must shape fear into facts. Emily stood before he spoke. He described internal injuries, a concussion, the decision to induce a coma to protect swelling in the brain. The words felt measured, almost mathematical, stabilized, intubated, monitoring, 24 hours critical. Emily asked a single question, "Can I see him?" And the surgeon hesitated just long enough for the pause to say everything. He promised a check. He walked away. Emily's hands found each other and knotted themselves into a promise to stand upright. The clock moved with the stubbornness of an old tractor. Nurses changed shift. The television cycled to the night's headlines. The vending machine swallowed bills and delivered sugar. Emily tried to read, failed, tried to text someone her thoughts, failed again. She remembered the cadence of Michael's footsteps on the stairs at home, the sound of the cabinet door that never closed right, the scrape of his laugh when something delighted him more than it should have. She did not let herself summon memories that begged for a future. She held to the present the way a swimmer holds a breath that gets him to shore. Sometime near dawn, the social worker returned with a compromise. Emily could be escorted to unit and wait outside his room. She would not sign forms. She would not obstruct care. She could sit, and the sitting would mean something no form could capture. The corridor to the intensive care unit was colder, the lights dimmer, the hush deeper. Machines blinked in rooms like cautious constellations. A nurse with a badge that read Harper guided her to a chair placed just beyond a threshold marked by a red line on the floor. "Stay here," Harper said gently, "and I will let you know if the doctor can authorize more." Emily thanked her and sat with her coat folded across her lap, listening to the rhythm of machines that spoke in a language without verbs. Through the half-open door she caught only pieces. The arc of monitor, the rise and fall of a blanket, the steady drip of medicine like punctuation in a sentence she could not quite read. She tried to count the breaths and lost track. She tried to count the minutes and lost those too. A housekeeping cart rattled past, and a radio somewhere down the hall leaped to him in a whisper. Emily stared at the floor tiles, at the pattern of scuffs that told stories about wheels and shoes and nights like this one. Footsteps sounded behind her, and a voice she recognized from childhood lifted the air into a sharper clarity. Karen arrived wrapped in a wool coat. Her mouth sent a line of purpose, her hair pulled back as if braced for a courtroom. She looked at Emily, then passed her toward the room and said, "I came as soon as I heard." Emily nodded, grateful and wary at once. Karen spoke to the nurse with the smooth tone of someone accustomed to insisting. She invoked family, responsibility, the importance of clarity. The exchange stayed civil, anchored by hospital rules that leveled every argument. Karen turned back to Emily and said, "We need to make sure the right people are making decisions." Emily swallowed the response that rose like heat and said only, "He needs us quiet." The morning shifted toward noon, and the air warmed slightly with coffee drifting from the break room. A doctor stopped and gave an update that felt like a plateau. No worse, no better, the long middle that tempts hope and dread to trade jackets. Emily asked if Michael might recognize a voice in the room, if hearing could travel where consciousness could not. The doctor said sometimes it helped. Sometimes it helped the ones doing the talking more than the one doing the listening. Emily held those words like a pass to a border she was not sure she could cross. She was still seated when a nurse with cropped auburn hair and a name tag that read Miles appeared at her side. Miles carried kindness like a quiet tool. She asked if Emily had eaten, asked if she needed a blanket, asked if there was someone she wanted the hospital to call. Emily shook her head to each, then drew a breath that felt like a decision. "If he can hear," she said, "I should be in there." Miles did not answer immediately. She pressed her lips together, considering something that was weighted with both compassion and policy. She glanced toward the room, then back to Emily, her eyes searching for a truth that would justify bending a line on the floor. The hallway stilled for a heartbeat, as if every machine and every voice had agreed to listen. Miles leaned closer, her voice low but unyielding, as if she knew that words at this hour must be both gentle and exact. "I need to understand your relationship to Michael," she said. "Who are you to him?" The question lingered in the sterile air between them, not loud, yet heavier than the steady beeping from the monitors down the hall. Emily felt the weight of it press into her chest, the kind of question that demanded more than facts. She could have said she was his ward, or that he'd raised her since she was a baby, or that their lives were woven so tightly together no law could untangle them. But those would have been explanations, not truth. She stood, straightened her shoulders, and met the nurse's eyes. "I'm his daughter," she said, her voice quiet but unshaken. "Always was." Miles didn't write anything down. She simply studied Emily for a moment, as if weighing something beyond hospital policy. Then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and turned toward the room. "Come with me," she said, her tone brisk but not cold. The red line on the floor was no longer a barrier. Emily crossed it without hesitation, following the nurse into a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. The sound of the ventilator filled the space, rhythmic and mechanical. Each breath an unfamiliar surrogate for the man who had always seemed unstoppable. Michael lay still, his face pale against the white pillowcase, his head wrapped in a neat bandage that disappeared beneath his hairline. The sight landed like a stone in Emily's stomach. She moved to his side slowly, the way one approaches something fragile, afraid even her presence might cause harm. She took his hand, cool beneath her fingers, and threaded her own through his as though she could knit him back together with touch alone. "It's me," she whispered, leaning closer. "I'm here." The nurse adjusted a monitor and then stepped out, leaving them in a bubble of hushed sound. Emily began to speak, not because she knew it would help, but because the silence seemed too large to let stand. She told him about the drive to Wichita, about the way the frost had clung to the grass that morning. She told him she'd skip breakfast because nothing tasted right without his voice somewhere in the background. Her words wandered to memories. How he'd driven her home from her first job at the diner, how he'd stood in the rain during her high school graduation just to take pictures when the ceremony moved outside. She spoke until her throat felt raw, the steady hiss of the ventilator punctuating each pause. At some point, the curtain at the doorway shifted and a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. He explained that Michael's condition was stable but delicate, that swelling in the brain could take time to resolve. Recovery, if it came, would not be immediate. Emily nodded at each sentence, gripping Michael's hand tighter as if to anchor him to her side. When the doctor asked if she understood, she answered yes, though the word fell hollow. She understood the medical facts. What she couldn't grasp was the image of him in his bed, still and silent. As the day stretched into afternoon, Emily remained at his side. She didn't ask for updates unless someone offered them. She simply stayed. Occasionally, a nurse would stop by to check vitals or adjust in 4-line, offering her small smiles as though they understood the kind of vigil she kept. Between those moments, Emily let her mind drift through the years they'd shared. The quiet car rides home from basketball practice, the sound of his boots on the porch, the way his laughter had a crack to it when something truly delighted him. She held on to those fragments like they were talismans. Karen appeared once, stepping into the room with the hesitance of someone not sure she belonged. She stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded, eyes darting between Michael and Emily. "How is he?" she asked, her tone almost neutral. Emily answered without looking away from him, giving only the brief update the doctor had provided. Karen lingered for a minute, then left, her footsteps fading down the hall. The air seemed easier to breathe once she was gone. Late in the evening, as shadows lengthened across the room, Emily noticed the smallest twitch of his fingers beneath hers. It could have been nothing, a reflex, a muscle reacting to something unseen, but it was enough to make her lean forward. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling now, "I don't care how long it takes. I'm not going anywhere." She stayed like that for hours, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest, listening to the machinery that for now kept the rhythm of his life. When the night nurse came to dim the lights, she offered Emily a blanket and suggested she rest in the chair. Emily thanked her but kept her seat upright, unwilling to surrender even the smallest part of her watch. She had no promise from the doctors that he could hear her, no assurance he knew she was there, but she knew him, and she knew that if their roles were reversed, he would not leave her side. The hours passed slowly, each one folding into the next, until the windows began to pale with the first suggestion of dawn. Emily's body ached from stillness. Her eyes burned from the strain of keeping them open, but she refused to step away. At some point, she realized that she wasn't just waiting for him to wake up. She was holding on to the simple, unshakable truth she'd spoken to the nurse. No matter what anyone said, no matter what papers did or didn't exist, she was his daughter. Always was. Always would be. And as the morning light crept across the floor toward his bed, she decided that even if it took weeks or months, she would keep telling him that, over and over, until he found his way back to her. The first sign of change came weeks later, on a gray morning when winter was beginning to lose its grip on the city. Emily had returned to hospital early, her bag slung over one shoulder, a coffee in hand that she barely tasted. The nurses greeted her with nods that had become routine, but that morning, there was a different note in their voices, a careful optimism that made her chest tighten. When she stepped into Michael's room, the softening machines was the same, but the air felt charged with something new. His eyelids fluttered once, then again, slow and unsteady, as though he was trying to lift a curtain that had been closed for too long. Emily rose from her chair and moved closer, the coffee forgotten on the windowsill. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking around a single word. His eyes opened just enough for her to catch the brown she knew so well, dull by exhaustion but still recognizably his. For a moment he simply stared at her, confusion flickering at the edges of his gaze, and then his mouth curved, just slightly, just enough to be a smile. It was tired, almost fragile, but it was his. Emily's breath caught, the kind of relief that felt almost painful rushing through her. The doctors came quickly, checking reflexes, speaking to him in slow, clear sentences. He didn't say much, only a few murmured acknowledgments, but his gaze followed Emily whenever she moved. She stayed near, holding his hand while the medical team adjusted equipment and explained the long road ahead. They talked about physical therapy, speech exercises, and memory work. None of it sounded easy, but Emily listened as though each instruction was a map leading him back to the life they had before. In the days that followed, progress came in small increments. A squeeze of her hand, a word spoken without prompting, his head turning toward her voice. Emily brought him stories from outside. The changing weather, updates from neighbors, the results of her midterm exams. She read aloud from the sports section, even if the games weren't his favorites, because she knew he liked the way she stumbled through the statistics. Sometimes she just sat beside him in silence, their hands linked, the quiet saying what words couldn't. Karen visited a few times, her manner more restrained than before. She brought flowers once, left them on the windowsill, and didn't mention paperwork or legalities. Emily appreciated the effort, even if the space between them remained wide. Other relatives called occasionally, their voices full of polite concern. But it was Emily who stayed every morning and every night, measuring her days by the rhythm of his recovery. When the time finally came for him to leave the hospital, spring had begun to settle in. The grass outside was a softer shade of green, and the air carried the scent of thawed earth. Michael moved carefully with the aid of a walker, each step deliberate but determined. Emily walked beside him as they made their way toward the exit, the automatic doors parting like a quiet welcome. In the parking lot, she helped him into the passenger seat of the truck he'd once taught her to drive. He smiled faintly at the familiarity of it, resting his hand on the dashboard as if greeting an old friend. Recovery at home was slow, but steady. Emily adapted her schedule around his therapy appointments, cooking meals that balanced nutrition with comfort, sitting with him through exercises that tested his patience. Sometimes they laughed at the clumsy moments. Other times they let the frustration pass in silence. But each day brought a little more strength, a little more ease in his movements. And with every small victory, the unspoken bond between them deepened. One afternoon, weeks after his return, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a stack of forms. She had been thinking about it for months, the idea settling into her like something inevitable. When Michael came in from the porch, she looked up and met his gaze. "I want to change my name," she said. "Legally. I want it to be Carter on everything." For a moment he just stared at her, his eyes searching hers, and then he nodded slowly. "You don't have to do that for me," he said. She shook her head. "I'm doing it for us. For who we are." The paperwork took time, but eventually the documents came back. driver's license, bank accounts, university records, all bearing the name Emily Carter. She showed him the new ID one evening, sliding it across the table with a smile. He picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, and then placed it carefully back in her hand. "You've always been Emily Carter," he said. "Now the rest of the world just knows it, too." That summer, when he was strong enough to walk longer distances, they began taking evening strolls through the neighborhood. The air was warm, carrying the scent of cut grass and lilacs, and the sun sank low behind the rooftops as they walked side by side. Sometimes they talked about nothing in particular, the neighbor's new dog, the weather, a funny commercial they'd seen. Other times they walked in companionable silence, the kind that needed no filling. One evening, as they reached the old oak tree at the edge of the block, Emily glanced at him and felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Life had shifted. Seasons had turned, but the truth they'd carried through every change remained untouched. It wasn't the blood they shared, because they didn't. It was in the years of staying, of showing up, of never letting the other stand alone. She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. The world around them was the same as it had always been. Ordinary houses, ordinary streets. But Emily felt the weight of something extraordinary between them. And as they turned back toward home, she knew with absolute clarity that the promise she had made silently in the hospital was not bound by circumstance. It was a promise without an end. That no matter what came, she would walk beside him, and he beside her, for as long as there were steps left to take.